that are pinging.
Yep.
They're called nociceptors.
What does that mean?
Pain receptors.
Oh, okay.
All right, so it is 10 till. We are going to get started. So again, we are continuing on in the nervous system. This is our second part. We're going to do a fair bit of review as we go along so that we remember all the stuff that we have covered thus far. So we are going to start by looking at our pathway. What are we going to do as we go through this particular set of slides? We're going to do, again, a little tiny bit of introduction. We're going to, with terms that you have seen before, but just to remind ourselves, we are going to look again at general functions. We'll maybe add a little bit to that. We are going to look at divisions. We have talked about structural and functional, but we're going to do it again, and how the information flows from sensory to motor. This hopefully is going to look a great deal like negative feedback. We are then going to look at neural tissue. You've already seen it when we looked at this in chapter 3, but we're going to revisit it, and then we're going to add some more. We are going to look at the neuron plus the 6 neuroglial cells. We're going to talk about myelination, and then eventually we might start a little bit today, but then next week we will absolutely start talking about action potentials and membrane potential. We have mentioned this. We mentioned this when we talked about skeletal muscle, so we're going to add on to that. We're going to talk about that action potential. So we said in the nervous system, we said in the skeletal muscle system that the action potential comes down the axon. We're going to talk about what exactly is an action potential. How is it made? How is it maintained? How does it move? And so we're going to talk a lot about ions and channels. So eventually we'll look at channels again too. And then in this set of slides, we are going to finish up with synaptic transmission and a little bit of neurotransmitters. And again, we've looked at synaptic transmission in the muscle system. We're going to add to that. So again, along the way, going to be stuff you know, and then we're going to add to. So terms, right? We already know there are 2 main types of cells in the nervous system. We have our neurons. They are the structural and functional cells. They are the structural and functional units of the nervous system. And then we also have the neuroglial cells, also known as just glial cells. They support the neurons. Nerves. We defined what a nerve was on Monday. We said that it's a bundle of axons that are outside the brain and the spinal cord, because in the central nervous system there are no nerves. There are no nerves in your brain or your spinal cord. But we talked about how sort of we have pathways in our brain and our spinal cord. Do you remember what they're called? Starts with T.
Tracks.
Tracks, yes. But they are not nerves. They are just sort of bundles of axons that have a specific movement of their ions. So we also talked about 2 sort of sets of neurons, the cranial nerves. They come only from the brain and the spinal cord. And then there are 12 pair, again, paired. So we have 12 on the right side, 12 on the left side. Then we have our spinal nerves. There are 31 of them, 31 on the right side, 31 on the left side. We also mentioned a ganglion. when we were talking about the spinal cord. We talked about the ganglion on the dorsal nerve root. And a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So we did a drawing the other day of a neuron that sort of looked like this, right? And we said there was a nucleus here. This is the cell body right here. Now, your lab book may call it a cell body, or you may also see the word perikaryon, right? So, just in case you see this, it's just the cell body. It is this part right here. This part right here where the nucleus is, the majority of them in our nervous system. Something funny?
One of the slides is upside down.
Okay.
Sorry.
Did you flip it?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. So this is the cell body, right? Most of them are in the brain and the spinal cord. Very few of them are outside the brain or the spinal cord. And when they are, they're clustered together. And when they're clustered together, they are in a specific sort of housing, and that is known as a ganglion. And we will name some of the ganglion as we go along. Not all of them, right? But some of them. Now, we also have already talked about plexuses. Plexuses are networks, right? They are like a netting, and they are outside of the central nervous system. So again, these are terms we have already talked about. We've also talked about functions of the nervous system. We said that overall, the nervous system is here for us to receive information, figure out that information, and then do something with the information. That's the basic idea. But we do have sensory function and orientation. So what does that mean? It means that you are getting all sorts of information into your brain and spinal cord and adjusting accordingly, okay? So that can mean that you are, if you just ran here, you might be hot and you might start to sweat. It could also mean that if you are standing like I am, it means that you actually have information coming from different receptors in your brain, to your brain, that says you are leaning up against a wall, right? At the waist, you are bent over, your arms are crossed, and you've got one leg straight and one leg bent, right? All of that is sensory information. It is sent to your brain so you can orient to position. Again, you can orient to position. You can also orient to time and place. If we didn't have clocks, you could go outside, and if it's light outside, well, it must be daytime. Unless you live north of the Arctic Circle and then you're in 24-hour day, right? So that doesn't really count. But that's orientation. You've got motor function. We talked about this endlessly when we were talking about your skeletal muscles. That's the motor function. You also have other motor function, any organ that does something, like a gland, or your smooth muscle, or your cardiac muscle. They also have motor function. And then assimilation. Assimilation is taking information and making it part of you. That is actually the goal of learning, is assimilation. right? You can learn from doing things correctly. You can also learn from doing things incorrectly, right? A lot of recipes are fine-tuned because of incorrect something or other, right? I remember when I was growing up, then Mom would try a new recipe and Dad would very politely tell her that she didn't really need to keep that recipe, right? Or if she did, maybe she could, as we used to call it, doctor it up. In other words, fix it. So, but that would be assimilation. We learn by being successful and by not being successful. There's a whole lots of stuff that I have learned the past couple of years in trying to keep my house in order, about not doing that again. So, just, things that if they don't go right, then you learn not to do it that way again. And then instinctual behavior. So, whether you are in the camp of humans have instincts or humans do not have instincts, doesn't make any difference. Instincts are kept in the nervous system. Instincts are complex behaviors that are not learned. They are what we call inherent. You come with them. For instance, birds that migrate, right? We have Canada geese, right? And they migrate from Canada and up close to the Arctic Circle, all the way down here to Nebraska and even farther south. So when they migrate north, they have their chicks. The parents will raise the chicks, and as soon as the chicks can fly, the parents say, "Good luck, see you later." They don't they don't necessarily stay around them any longer. But those chicks are responsible then at the right time to then migrate hundreds, if not thousands of miles somewhere else that they have never been and get there successfully, and they do. There are birds that migrate to Northern Europe, and then they actually winter down in Africa. So that is what we would call a very complex behavior that is not learned, right? That would be an example of an instinct. But regardless, if you think humans have instincts or not, it would be kept in your nervous system. Does that make sense? All right, so we've also talked about the divisions of the nervous system. We've talked about structural divisions. We have our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord. And then we have everything else, which is the peripheral nervous system. So those are all of the cranial nerves, all of the spinal nerves and named nerves. Those are also all of the sensory receptors that are attached to the peripheral nervous system. Now, we've already talked about the central nervous system. We've talked about the brain, we've talked about all the parts of the brain, we've talked about the spinal cord and all the parts of the spinal cord. We are not, because it is way beyond the scope of the time that we have, although it would be really interesting. We're not going to talk about the functional areas in the brain or the spinal cord. If we had another week, we could, but we don't. But we are going to talk in the peripheral nervous system. We are going to talk about the functional divisions. In other words, we can look at all of the nerves all of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, and categorize them based on sensory and motor, and even farther than that. They actually do line up very, very nicely, as we will see a little later on. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the peripheral nervous system. We eventually will talk about the senses, which are going to then connect to the sensory portion of our peripheral nervous system. But we're at the moment going to focus on the motor function. The motor function. So what does this actually look like, and how does all this information move in comparison to, or in relation to our central nervous system? Well, this is our information flow. On the left, we have sensory. That is flowing towards the central nervous system. That is consistent with what we have said from the beginning. And then on the right, this is all motor and moving away from the central nervous system. So again, we are in the peripheral nervous system. We have left the brain and the spinal cord. So out here, we're going to start with some sort of a stimulus. Right? Touch, light, pain, poke, heat, chemical change, level change, all sorts of things. That is going to be picked up by a receptor, specifically a sensory receptor. Okay? The sensory receptor is going to use sensory nerves and neurons to send information to the central nervous system, brain or spinal cord. Okay? Now, if we need to get up to the brain, we will go to the spinal cord first and then up into the brain. So, does that make sense, getting into our central nervous system? Okay, then we need to leave. So, over here, this is the motor division. The motor division, again, eventually we're going out to some sort of an effector, but there are two sections to the motor system. We've already talked about this, the somatic nervous system. This are all of the nerves that go to the skeletal muscle. They innervate the skeletal muscle with all those neuromuscular junctions. And they cause skeletal muscle to contract, right? And we've talked about contraction, so we're not gonna hash that over again. So we've already talked about this. I'm not gonna do it again. We're gonna talk about this. This is known as the autonomic nervous system, or the part of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system that is automatic. We do not have control over this. Don't have control. We may be able to influence, but we can't change. And you'll see how we can influence as we go along. So the autonomic nervous system has two sections. We have what is known as the sympathetic division. So the full name is the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay? So sympathetic division is all about, let's get ready to do something. Fight, flight, or stress. Some people like to put fear in there, but sometimes stress is not fear, it's just stress. Right? But that's sympathetic. We also have the parasympathetic, and that is all about sort of doing kind of day-to-day activities. You are doing things, but it's more about things that you would do as you would sit and rest, like digestion, peeing, pooping, things like that. So that is the parasympathetic division. That is the rest and digest. Now, both of these will have an effect on the effectors. Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, right? Those two muscles, not skeletal, okay? Skeletal is somatic. So we're only dealing with cardiac and smooth muscle and many of the glands. Now, again, both of these, somatic and autonomic, they have their output is all about moving, changing movement, changing metabolism, changing your heart rate, changing your breathing rate, changing something to keep it within normal limits. Okay? So this really ought to look familiar. It ought to look a little bit like negative feedback, okay? Because we have some sort of stimulus picked up by a receptor, sent to the control center, either the brain or the spinal cord, and then sent out to some effector. Depending upon which effector would mean you're either using the somatic, skeletal muscle, or the autonomic, cardiac, smooth, or glands. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Questions? All right, so we are going to focus again on the functional portion of the peripheral nervous system. And we're going to focus on the motor side. When we get into senses like seeing and taste and smelling, we'll deal more over here on the sensory side. Okay? So these are the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Okay? We've seen these before. So we have sensory coming in to the central nervous system. We said that word was afferent. Again, the sensory portion that's where we detect things. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it light? Is it dark? And even inside of us, what is your heart rate? What is your breathing rate? What is your blood pressure? How much blood do you have? How much calcium do you have in your body? How much sodium? How much potassium? All those things, all those variables can be monitored, and the receptors can send sensory information to the central nervous system, right? Via sensory nerves. And then the motor carries impulses away to some sort of an effector. Your muscles, that's the easiest one to see. Your muscles, or your heart, or your lungs, or your gut, or your pancreas, or your spleen, or your bone marrow. All of those things are going to have an effect on variables. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? Does that make sense? All right, so the motor division is subdivided. It is subdivided, right? And we're going to subdivide, we've already seen somatic, and then the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, right? So again, this is automatic. It is what we call subconscious. So we are not actively thinking about it, which is so nice, because this means we can sleep and not die, right? I mean, think about it. Okay? While you're sleeping, your heart still has to pump. Your lungs still need to fill with air and empty with air, because that's a long time to hold your breath. Okay? So you also need food for all your cells. Okay? You need to keep that available for them. So again, it is subconscious or automatic. Now, when we are looking at the autonomic nervous system, again, we have our brain and our spinal cord. We are looking at the periphery. And when we do that, we look at what we call a two-neuron system. Two-neuron system. So we're going to have one that starts here, somewhere in the central nervous system. It is going to come out, and it is going to synapse with another neuron. Okay? Another neuron. I drew this wrong. Okay? We're going to do this a little differently. Okay? We're going to put one here, and then we'll connect this. Okay? And this, because there is a cell body, that's the dark dot. Because there is a cell body, and we are not in the central nervous system, this is a ganglion. This is a ganglion. Right? And so then out here, we'll synapse with some sort of an effector. So when we are looking at the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, we're going to look at these two neurons. And to keep them straight, we're going to name them. We're going to say, where are they in relation to the ganglion? Where are they in relation to the ganglion? And remember, this is motor, so we are headed out. So this one is pre-ganglionic, and then this one is post-ganglionic. Pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic. And eventually, when we get a little farther into sympathetic and parasympathetic, the length of these switches, which makes it easier to tell them apart. So, again, we are in the motor division, leaving the central nervous system, of the peripheral nervous system. We are going to divide that autonomic nervous system actually into 3 parts, but we're only really going to focus on 2 of them. So we have the sympathetic, which gets us ready for physical activity. So the run for your life, that's what sympathetic is all about. Parasympathetic is all those things, again, as we said, digesting, peeing, pooping, just sort of maintaining the body. You're still doing things, you're just not like running for your life. And then the third one is the enteric. The enteric nervous system is within the walls of your digestive system. It does communicate with the central nervous system, but it does have some, what we call autonomy. It actually can do things all on its own. Okay? So, questions. Right, so we are looking at, so all of this is all about function, right? So anytime we talk about the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, it is what is happening, okay? So, all of this, remember, is made of, and the functions occur on these cells, these neurons. So hopefully you remember it. So this should maybe look like the cells, the slides that you looked at in chapter 3, tissues.
I think, yeah.
3? Okay, good. This is what we call a nerve smear. So it is how we get to see neurons. So the big, huge pink guy right here, that's a neuron. All of those other little tiny in the background, those are the neuroglial cells, which we will get to. But again, here's a diagram over here. So this is where we are getting information. And these little extensions, these are dendrites. Dendrites sort of stick out and they bring information to the cell body. They bring information to the cell body. Right? So there can be lots of them. Lots, and we'll see a slide later where it's like, oh my goodness, I would not even want to count how many dendrites and dendrite branches there are. Because if you see, right, the dendrite itself actually is what connects directly to the cell body, but notice that the dendrites can all branch. So, and that means every dendrite branch can talk to a different neuron. So that means that all your neurons in your brain and your spinal cord, they're all talking to each other. Must be very loud up there. Okay? So these are dendrites, this is the cell body, and then we have one extension that's a bit longer, and it's maybe a little bit bigger, and this is the axon. This is what we dealt with when we were talking about the muscle contraction. We said the action potential comes down the axon to the muscle cell. Right? So the axon, there is typically only one, and it will carry the information away from the cell body. Now, how does the cell know what information to send or how much information to send? Well, there is a section, and it's right here, leaving the first part of the axon. It's right in this area, like this little triangle. This is known as, there are two parts there, and the part that we are concerned with is known as the axon hillock. And the axon hillock makes up part of what we call the trigger zone. The trigger zone. So what happens is the dendrites are all bringing information into the cell body. And the cell body has to determine what message is going to leave on the axon. It doesn't decide. It doesn't look and say, oh, that's better than that. That's not how it is. If you think about it as the dendrites, thumbs up, thumbs down, right? You have, these are the messages. Again, this is very simplified. So coming in on the dendrites, right? The action potentials that are coming in on the dendrites, they are either going to want to send another action potential, that would be our thumbs up. Some of the dendrites may be bringing in information that says, no, we don't want to send an action potential down the axon, right? So yes, let's send an action potential. No, let's don't. And so all of those are coming down the dendrites, and to add to this, there are going to be other neurons that have axon terminals that touch, that come, well, don't touch, that come and have a synapse with the cell body. So we have information coming in the dendrites. We have information synapsing from multiple other neurons that are like reaching out and sending information. So all of that has to be counted, if you will. And all of that will be sending thumbs up, thumbs down. So what happens here at the axon hillock is sort of like a counting house. How many thumbs up do you have? How many thumbs down do you have? Which do you have more of? If you have 1,003 thumbs up and 867 thumbs down, well, I guess we are going to send the action potential, right? We are more likely to send the, yup, let's go down the axon. On the other hand, if the thumbs down is 867 and the thumbs up are 542, well then the thumbs down outweigh this. They outnumber this. So what that means is we're either not going to send an action potential or we're not going to send as many. It does depend on where this is, okay? But does that make sense? And that determination of thumbs up, thumbs down occurs at the axon hillock. Does that make sense? Questions?
No.
So, our neurons, they are all the structural and the functional units of the nervous system, but they do not all look like this. They come in different, what we call structural classes. They come in different structural classes. They are all going to carry action potentials. They are all going to help us function. But they are not all going to be the same in the same place. Again, different neurons for different places. So this very first one, and we can see the yellow arrow, that's the direction of the impulse, right? So again, we bring in the dendrites, we leave on the axon. So this very first one is known as a multipolar axon. Let's try that word again, a multipolar neuron. It has one axon, and that's here, but it also has multiple dendrites. Multiple dendrites. So multiple dendrites, one axon is a multipolar neuron. If you have one axon but only one dendrite, now again, remember we said a dendrite actually attaches to the cell body, right? How many are attaching to the cell body? We only have one right here. So if we have one axon, one dendrite, this is called a bipolar neuron. A bipolar neuron. We find bipolar neurons in our eyes, in our ears, even in our nose, right? These help us to smell. They help us to smell. The dendrites basically are going to stick down into our nasal cavities, and they're going to pick up information about odors in the air. They're going to create an impulse, and they're going to send it down the axon, which is going through that cribriform plate of your ethmoid bone to the axons, right, on the axons to the axon terminal, and those axon terminals, they're going to be synapsing with your olfactory nerves. Those cranial nerve number 1. Okay? So again, we have they're in different places, like the multipolar, well, that is really the majority of neurons in your central nervous system and in your motor neurons, because they can come out and they can have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of branches that could go to skeletal muscle if we needed them to. Our third option over here is what we call a pseudo-unipolar. Now, if you notice the cell body, it's like off to the side, and so it really only has an axon attached to the cell body. It does have these that look like dendrites, but again, our definition of a dendrite was something that attached directly to the cell body, and these don't. So we would say they were dendrite-like. And we will find these in the eye as well. So now we've got 2 different kinds in the eye. And then this last one, right, it doesn't even have an axon. It doesn't have an axon. It only has dendrites that scientists have been able to find. This is called an anaxonic. We find this one in the eye too. Yeah. So we have 3 different kinds of neurons in our eyeballs. 3 different kinds in our eyeballs. They seem to work. But again, these, even though they are structurally different, they will all carry impulses the same way. It's all about what's going on at the cell membrane, with the sodium on the outside and the potassium on the inside. And it does not make any difference what the neuron looks like if it is carrying information to the central nervous system. It is sensory. If it is carrying information away from the central nervous system, it is motor. Now, if one of those is used in the spinal cord, and that is the only place that it is known as an interneuron. It's not motor, and it's not sensory. Think of it sort of like an extension cord, right? You're taking one plugged into one end, and then you're plugging into another end. And that's really all an interneuron is. It helps information get like across the spinal cord. Okay? Does that make sense? Questions? All right, so we're actually going to take another break. I know it's not been very long, but this is a lot. So let's take a break. Let's come back at 20 till, I know it looks like 5 minutes there, but according to this, it's actually 7 minutes. So stand up, move about, get some blood and oxygen to your brain.